The bell above the door of the Starlight Diner gave a fragile, metallic chime every time the icy winter wind pushed against the glass. But inside, the air smelled of burnt coffee, fry grease, and cheap vanilla floor wax. It was 6 o'clock on a rainy Tuesday evening, the kind of quiet night where the fluorescent lights flickered softly against the faded yellow vinyl booths. 82-year-old Martha sat near the end of the counter, her small frame swallowed by a faded knitted cardigan that had seen better decades. Her hands, swollen at the knuckles from years of hard labor, trembled slightly as she held a small black and white photograph close to her eyes. She wasn't bothering anyone. She had ordered a $3 cup of black coffee, paid with exact change from a worn coin purse, and was simply trying to keep warm while waiting for the local city bus. But in a small town where power was held by a select few, peace was always a fragile luxury. The heavy glass door swung open with a violent thud, letting in a draft of freezing rain and the aggressive clatter of expensive leather shoes. Richard Vance walked into the diner like he owned the ground beneath it. He was 38 years old, dressed in a tailored wool coat that cost more than the diner's line cook made in 2 months, and his eyes carried the sharp, arrogant coldness of a man who had never been told no in his entire life. Vance was the newly appointed deputy district attorney for the county, a man whose rising career was built on ruthless ambition and a total lack of empathy. Behind him shuffled his junior associate, a nervous young man holding an overflowing leather briefcase. Vance was on his phone, yelling at someone about a delayed campaign contribution, his voice echoing loudly across the small, mostly empty diner. The handful of locals in the diner, an old truck driver in a corner booth, a young waitress named Sarah, and a teenage dishwasher, instinctively lowered their eyes. Everyone in town knew who Vance was, and everyone knew that standing near him was like standing near a lightning rod in a thunderstorm. Vance slammed his briefcase onto a table 2 feet from where Martha was sitting, utterly ignoring the old woman. Sarah stepped forward, her hands shaking slightly as she placed a menu on the table. Vance didn't even look up at her. He simply waved his hand dismissively, complaining loudly into his phone about the dirty, pathetic state of the town's local establishments. He was high on his own authority, fueled by the conviction that the law was not something he served, but something he possessed. As Vance aggressively pulled off his coat, his heavy elbow struck the edge of Martha's tiny white porcelain coffee mug. The dark liquid splashed across the Formica counter, soaking directly into the corner of the fragile black and white photograph Martha held in her fingers. Martha let out a soft, involuntary gasp, her fingers scrambling to lift the wet paper before the ink bled completely away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't yell. She simply looked at Vance, her eyes clouded with age but bright with gentle dignity, and said softly, "Excuse me, sir. You spilled my coffee, and you damaged the only picture I have left of my late husband." Vance stopped his phone conversation for a fraction of a second, glancing down at Martha, as if he had just discovered an insect on his shoe. Instead of apologizing, or even ignoring her, his face twisted into a snarl of irritation. He felt humiliated that a frail, poorly dressed old woman had dared to correct him in public. "Watch your mouth, old lady," Vance barked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You're sitting in a public place looking like a vagrant. You're lucky I don't call the local precinct to have you cleared out for loitering." Martha's hands trembled harder, but she held her ground, holding up the soggy picture. "It was an accident, sir. A simple apology would have been enough." That was the spark that set off the explosion. Fueled by stress, hubris, and a deep-seated belief that he was utterly untouchable, Vance snapped. He didn't just yell. He took 2 steps forward, reached down, and violently snatched the delicate paper from Martha's hands, ripping it right through the center. When Martha instinctively reached up to grab it back, Vance shoved her hard. The violent, sudden force sent the frail, 82-year-old woman tumbling backward off her swivel stool. Her head struck the edge of the metal counter with a sickening thud before she hit the linoleum floor, where she lay completely motionless, a thin trickling stream of red dark against her white hair. A collective gasp echoed through the diner, but a heavy, Terrifying silence quickly followed. Sarah screamed, dropping her notepad, while the old truck driver in the back half stood from his booth, horrified. But Vance didn't show an ounce of remorse. Instead, his legal mind immediately went into overdrive, calculating self-preservation over humanity. He looked down at the unconscious woman, pulled a silk handkerchief from his pocket, and wiped his hands as if cleaning off dirt. "She assaulted me," Vance declared loudly, his voice artificial and commanding, aiming his words at the terrified employees. "You all saw it. She grabbed my arm. She was unstable and aggressive. If any of you say otherwise to the police, I will personally see to it that this health hazard dump is shut down by morning and every one of you faces perjury charges." The sheer weight of Vance's legal title and political connection paralyzed the room. The local police chief was his personal friend, and the mayor was his uncle. In this town, Vance's word wasn't just evidence, it was the law. Sarah knelt down by Martha, sobbing silently as she held a clean napkin to the old woman's bleeding forehead, while Vance casually picked up his leather briefcase, straightened his tie, and stepped toward the exit as if nothing more than a minor inconvenience had occurred. He thought he had cleared the board. He thought his authority was absolute, and that a nameless, penniless old woman on the floor of a roadside diner was simply a footnote in his rise to power. He had no idea that the universe was about to hold him accountable in a way no court of law ever could. Just as Vance reached for the chrome handle of the diner's front door, the heavy glass didn't push open, it vibrated. A low, thunderous rumble vibrated through the floorboards, so deep and powerful it rattled the glass pie display on the counter. Outside in the dark, rainy night, the roar of dozens of heavy V-twin motorcycle engines cut through the storm like a swarm of mechanical beasts. Bright headlights sliced through the foggy diner windows, casting long, dramatic shadows across the linoleum floor. The engines didn't pass by. They cut off one by one, right outside the front entrance, leaving behind an eerie, heavy silence broken only by the rhythmic drumming of cold rain against the roof. The diner door swung open slowly, but this time, nobody walked in right away. First came the smell of cold rain, wet leather, heavy gasoline, and an unmistakable aura of absolute, unyielding power. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped through the doorway, wiping water from his thick leather vest. Across the front of his worn leather cut were two words stitched in bold, white thread: Hell's Angels. Above it was the title President. His arms were covered in faded black tattoos. His face was weathered like beaten wood, and his steel-gray eyes scanned the room with a cold, terrifying calm that instantly stripped the air from the diner. Behind him, three more massive riders stepped into the entryway, their towering frames blocking the exit completely. Vance took an involuntary step back, his arrogant composure cracking for the very first time. He cleared his throat, trying to summon his legal authority like a shield. "Listen here," Vance said, his voice trembling slightly despite his best efforts to sound tough. "This is a private situation. I am Deputy District Attorney Richard Vance, and I suggest you step aside." The tall biker didn't even look at Vance. His eyes swept across the room until they landed on the floor near the counter, where Sarah was kneeling beside the pale, bleeding figure of old Martha. The massive man froze. The air in the diner seemed to drop 20 degrees instantly. The stoic, hardened expression on the biker's face broke, replaced by a sudden, raw look of pure agony and terror. He dropped his heavy leather gloves onto the floor and rushed across the room, falling heavily to his knees beside the fallen old woman. "Ma," his voice rasped out, no longer the intimidating roar of an outlaw leader, but the broken, desperate voice of a terrified child. "Ma, look at me. Open your eyes." He gently gathered her fragile frame into his massive tattooed arms, holding her as if she were made of fragile glass, his hands trembling violently. The truth crashed down onto the room like a physical blow. The nameless, frail old lady Vance had shoved to the floor wasn't a forgotten vagrant. Her name was Martha Miller, and she was the mother of Marcus Grizzly Miller, the national president of one of the most powerful and fiercely loyal motorcycle clubs in the country. Marcus had grown up in this town, raised by a single mother who worked 3 jobs to keep food on the table while he fought his way through a rough youth. Though Marcus had chosen a life on the edge of the law, his devotion to his mother was legendary, sacred, and absolute. Marcus turned his head slowly towards Sarah, his eyes red and brimming with unshed tears. "Who did this?" he asked, his voice low, quiet, and terrifyingly steady. Sarah, terrified of Vance, but overcome with sympathy for the heartbroken son, hesitated for only a second before raising her hand and pointing a shaking finger directly at Richard Vance, who was currently trying to slowly edge his way toward the back exit near the kitchen. Marcus stood up slowly. Standing at 6'4" and over 250 pounds, he towered over the prosecutor. The 3 other bikers stepped forward, silently blocking every possible exit in the building. Vance's heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached into his coat, pulling out his official county badge and holding it up like a holy cross meant to ward off a monster. "Touch me, and you're going to federal prison for the rest of your life." Vance shrieked, his polished arrogance completely dissolving into panic. "I am an officer of the court. She attacked me. It was self-defense. I have immunity." Marcus didn't strike him. He didn't pull a weapon. He simply walked until he was inches from Vance's face, looking down into the prosecutor's terrified eyes with a cold, calculating intensity that was far worse than physical violence. "You think that little piece of metal makes you invincible?" Marcus whispered, his breath warm against Vance's pale skin. "You think your title gives you the right to destroy helpless people? My mother raised me to respect the strong and protect the weak. You are a coward with a title. And tonight, I'm not going to break your body, prosecutor. I'm going to destroy your life." At that moment, the wail of sirens cut through the rainy night as 2 local police cruisers pulled up outside, their red and blue lights flashing against the diner glass. Vance let out a hysterical laugh, a wave of relief washing over his face. "You're done," Vance sneered, his arrogance instantly returning as he saw the flashing lights. "That's the chief. He's my personal friend. You and your gang of trash are going away forever." 2 local officers rushed through the door with guns drawn, shouting for everyone to keep their hands visible. The local police chief, a veteran officer named Miller, stepped inside, his eyes widening in shock as he took in the scene. The injured old woman on the floor, the towering Hells Angels president, and the wildly frantic prosecutor. Vance immediately strode forward, pointing wildly at Marcus. "Chief, arrest this man immediately. He and his gang are threatening a public official. His mother assaulted me. I defended myself. And now they're holding me hostage." Chief Miller looked from Vance to the massive biker, then down at the bloodstain on the floor. But instead of drawing his handcuffs to arrest Marcus, the chief slowly lowered his weapon, his expression turning cold and dark. The chief turned to Sarah. "Sarah, tell me what happened." "Exactly." Sarah stepped forward, her voice clear and brave. She detailed every single second. Vance's phone call, his deliberate cruelty, his violent ripping of the old woman's photograph, and the vicious push that sent Martha to the floor. Vance scoffed violently, stepping toward the chief. "Are you seriously taking the word of a minimum wage waitress over a deputy district attorney? I will have your badge by morning, Miller. I command you to arrest these men right now." But Chief Miller didn't budge. He looked at Vance with profound disgust. "Richard," the chief said quietly, "you've spent years abusing your power in this town, stepping on anyone who couldn't fight back. But you made a fatal mistake tonight." The chief turned to Marcus. "The paramedics are outside. Let them take your mother to the hospital." Marcus nodded slowly, watching with tender concern as the paramedics carefully lifted his mother onto a stretcher. As they carried Martha out to the ambulance, her eyes fluttered open for a brief second. She looked at her son, her voice barely a whisper. "Marcus, don't do anything foolish, please." Marcus kissed his mother's frail, cold forehead. "I won't, Ma. I promise. I'm going to let the law handle him. The real law." Vance laughed out loud, a bitter, desperate sound. The real law? I am the law in this county. You have nothing on me. It's my word against a bunch of nobodies. But Marcus simply smiled, a slow, terrifying smile that sent a shiver down Vance's spine. Marcus reached into his leather vest and pulled out a small, metallic object. It wasn't a weapon. It was a sleek, high-end digital recording device, its tiny red light blinking softly. "You see, prosecutor," Marcus said smoothly, "we don't just ride motorcycles. We run a national brotherhood with resources you couldn't even dream of. My club was meeting here tonight because we support local businesses. I had my guys install high-definition security cameras with live audio feed inside this diner 3 weeks ago to protect the owner from local extortionists." Marcus pointed up toward a tiny black dome mounted in the corner of the ceiling, right above the counter. "Every word you spoke," Marcus continued, his voice echoing in the silent diner. "Every threat you made, your admission of guilt, and the exact moment you violently assaulted an 82-year-old woman. It was all recorded in 4K resolution, live-streamed directly to a secure cloud server, and sent 5 minutes ago to the State Attorney General, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and every major news outlet in the state." Vance's face drained of every ounce of color. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to catch himself on the edge of a booth. The legal immunity he had hidden behind his entire adult life didn't just crack, it shattered into a million pieces. The absolute proof of his corruption, his physical violence against an elderly citizen, and his blatant abuse of power were now in the hands of federal authorities and the press. There was no judge he could call, no politician he could bribe, and no spin his PR team could put on the footage. Within minutes, 2 black SUVs pulled up outside the diner. Federal agents stepped out, marching straight into the building with federal warrants. They didn't ask questions. They walked straight up to Richard Vance, turned him around, and snapped heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists. As they dragged the completely broken, trembling prosecutor out into the freezing rain, Marcus stood in the doorway, watching him. Vance looked back one last time, his eyes filled with total ruin, realizing that his high-flying career, his political future, and his freedom had vanished in the span of a single hour. An hour later, the rain began to clear, leaving the night quiet and still. Marcus sat in a chair beside his mother's bed in the local hospital room. Martha's forehead was bandaged, but her color had returned, and she was smiling weakly, holding her son's massive hand in her own. On the small bedside table sat a brand-new, beautifully framed portrait of her late husband, a restored, high-definition print that one of Marcus's club brothers had secretly spent the last hour digitally repairing and framing. Marcus looked down at his mother, his heart full, realizing a truth that no badge, title, or suit could ever alter. Real power isn't measured by the titles we hold, the authority we wield, or how many people bow down to our demands. True strength is found in how fiercely we protect those who cannot protect themselves. And no matter how high a corrupt man builds his tower of pride, justice always has a way of knocking on the door when he least expects it.